still have. I'm okay. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Is my microphone? You have to find it to know where it belongs. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to one of the last events, I guess, at COP. We're coming to the end of COP, but a really important event. We're going to talk today about the first special edition, agriculture edition of the Breakthrough Agenda Report on agriculture, focusing this year on 2 technologies and what needs to happen to have those technologies adopted. Fertilizer and livestock, 2 of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. I've got a really illustrious number of speakers. I'll introduce them as they come up rather than introducing them one by one now and taking a lot of time. And we have a short video and a presentation. So what I'd like to do now is to indicate to our video people, if we could just put on, we have a video message from Ban Ki-moon, and maybe we can start with that, then move to welcoming remarks and then the presentation. Thank you.
Dear panelists and guests, the worsening climate crisis is impacting every aspect of our lives. It's further increasing the threat of violent conflict, health issues, and food insecurity. All these global issues have consequences far beyond their immediate impacts, most particularly when it comes to food production. The right investment in research and innovation, smallholders farmers, especially women, indigenous peoples, and youth, can be part of the solution to many of the challenges we face today. In this regard, global champions like the worldwide research group CGIAR need to receive more funding for the acceleration of adaptation in agriculture to ensure food security and to protect biodiversity. But investment in agriculture, R&D, and innovation is not enough. Effective partnerships must be at the heart of our efforts to transform food systems. The agriculture breakthrough will be amplifying and reinforcing such a coordination. Only by working together can we achieve this ambitious agenda, which will unlock further collaboration for food systems and investment in agricultural research and innovation, while championing climate adaptive solutions. We must deliver on our high ambition, and we must do so now. Thank you.
A really inspiring video by Ban Ki-moon, someone who's really been at the center of a lot of the decision making and moved the debate on. So let me introduce myself before we begin. My name is James Stapleton and I'm the Senior Strategic Advisor for advocacy at CGIAR, and I said I've got a really illustrious group of people, but what I want to start off with is the representative from the Netherlands, Timo Gasbeck, Senior Policy Officer, Food Security at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Timo, building on what the former Secretary General has said, how can we maybe look at that in terms of welcoming remarks for what we're going to discuss today, which will be emissions reduction while protecting food production, for particularly in relation to fertilizer and livestock. Timo, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here in this panel, in this session, to talk about an important report and an important subject. As was already mentioned, climate change is impacting food security, and food security is impacting climate, and we cannot solve one without solving the other. That's becoming increasingly clear. Last year I had a conversation with Aditi at COP28, and she mentioned one term that really stuck with me, and that is the word non-linear. The impact of gradual climate change on our food system is non-linear. Things are accelerating faster and faster and faster, and we need to accelerate our responses much more than has been happening so far. The energy transition is on the way. The transport transitioning is beginning to happen, but the third big source of emissions is the food system, and we need to work on that urgently. One thing that came up this week in several discussions is the fact that yields are set to decline. If I read the IPCC report chapter on food, we're looking at a decline in yields that is larger than can be compensated with the current status of adaptation and innovation. That is a problem, because it means we need more land if we can't find alternative solutions. But land is a zero-sum game. If we don't want to take more nature, we need to look within the balance between food and feed and biofuel and fibers for how we can solve the things. Perhaps we need to look at thinking a bit out of the box. A point that was triggered with me when I visited Burundi a couple of years ago was that we always look at kilograms per hectare. But on a small farm, what matters is not kilograms per hectare, but kilocalories per hectare. It's a very different metric. And then you see that roots, tubers and banana give you double the kilocalories for the same area of land at the same input levels. So perhaps we need to look at stimulating a shift back from grains to roots, tubers and bananas. In the Netherlands, actually, it was a shift from grains to potatoes that enabled us to free up people to get into industry, and it triggered, or it stimulated, the Industrial Revolution in the Netherlands. So sometimes it is not always in continuing on the path that we've been working on, but maybe we need to look for other paths as well. And I think we might need to have looking at land use as a limit, we might need to look at very critically at not only livestock fodder but also biofuels. Because if it eats more land, and we need 50% more land to feed the world than we have now, maybe we need to look at reducing some of the other things to make things work. A last comment I'd like to make is the word smallholder. Smallholders were mentioned by Ban Ki-moon. A big challenge for smallholder farmers. I spent 4 years in Rwanda before I came back to the Netherlands. A big challenge that I encountered when talking to smallholder farmers in Rwanda is their very, very limited volume of turnover. So if an innovation costs $1,000, it is no problem for a farmer in the Netherlands to invest $1,000. But a household that earns $50 a month and needs to pay for some food, for water, for their house, for their clothes, their healthcare and education, they don't have the money. Even if they can borrow, then it's often difficult for them to repay from a small farm. So perhaps we need to look at divergent tracks, not send everyone on the same track, but look at innovations that work for larger farmers so they can accelerate reducing emissions, accelerate intensification in a sustainable way, and look at another set of innovations that work for smallholder farmers within their budgets. Because if we don't make it work for farmers themselves, it will not happen. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit. I wish you a very inspiring conversation today, and I look forward to hearing more about the report. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Timo. So before we get into the detail of the report, let me sort of just touch on a couple of points. The former Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, he talked about investment in agricultural research for development, at the increasing efficiency, innovation, and really transformation of the system. Timo, you spoke a little bit about trade-offs. You spoke about the need to get financing, but the challenges because of land limitations, but also because of the financial capacities of farmers, and maybe to look at different tracks of development, that maybe some people would be working in the food system, some people would leave the food system, and some would become maybe slightly more efficient and bigger. So there's different tracks for the development of the agro-food systems. So now let's take it back to, I'd like to introduce Dr. Aditi Mukherjee. She's the director of the CGIAR Impact Platform on Climate Change, Adaptation and Mitigation. I think that's the full title. Aditi is going to talk to us about the presentation of the Breakthrough Agenda Report, the agricultural section.
Thank you, James, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Hello, Sig. You can also sit here. She's one of our panelists. I'm making the presentation on behalf of the entire writing team. The names of everybody would be in the last slide. The first one is, I think most people in this room kind of know why we are talking about emission reduction in agriculture. And the part of the reason is agriculture has this very special place when it comes to climate change. It's both a victim of climate change in the fact that some of the world's poorest and most vulnerable people eke out their livelihoods over literally stamp-sized pieces of land. So very, very high level of vulnerability. And also the fact that agriculture is very weather dependent. So anything that happens with the droughts and floods, it's farmers and pastoralists who get directly impacted. But the other side of the story is also that agriculture and food system and the land as a whole also is a source of up to 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions. The numbers vary between 20 to 33%, but that's on what you include in that system. So therefore, if we have to reduce vulnerability of farmers, we cannot only talk of adaptation. We also need to talk around mitigation in this sector, but mitigation with adaptation co-benefits. So just a little bit of what happens in the agriculture sector is, this is the entire value chain from pre-production all the way to the waste, pre-production, production, post-production, diets and consumption. And we have emissions from every bit of it. So what will be important is to reduce emissions from every side of it with co-benefits with adaptation. But in this report, we are looking at the two of the major sources of emission, which is fertilizer manufacturing and fertilizer application and livestock enteric emissions. So this report, so just to put a caveat that these alone won't help, but this is a part of the larger, bigger picture. And the IPCC report is clear. If you have any ambition to be within 1.5, I just saw a tweet yesterday that says 1.5 is now as dead as a doorknob. But still, I think, up to 2, we have to reduce emissions, and agri-food is one of those. So that brings me to what is the Agriculture Breakthrough Agenda. The Agriculture Breakthrough Agenda was launched by the government of UK and Egypt in COP21 in Glasgow, along with there was a big role of the UN high-level champions, and we have Rebecca here. She would talk about their role in the Agriculture Breakthrough. And within the Agriculture Breakthrough, the goal is to make climate resilient, sustainable agriculture the most attractive and widely adopted option. So there are 17 participating countries as of now. In this report, we talk about 5 pathways of reducing emissions from agriculture. The first pathway is around reducing unsustainable consumption, where such consumption has harmful effects on health, climate and environment, and actually over application of fertilizer. One of it is certainly overconsumption of animal source protein, but another overconsumption happens in terms of excessive use of nitrogenous fertilizer. So that very much fits within the first pathway. The remaining 4 pathways are that we have to increase production of sustainable, healthy, nutritious food, particularly in the LMICs. I think that's important. Third pathway of achieving agriculture breakthrough would be to reduce damage to natural resources such as soil, water and biodiversity. The fourth pathway is around reducing emissions, either absolute or emission intensity, at least in the short run, with the aim of being absolute emission reduction, with the ultimate use of reducing absolute emission. And the fifth pathway is prioritize the needs and interests of smallholder producers by building their resilience. What we have done here is that we have kind of put the various approaches that we have under these buckets, and we can see that many of those approaches actually fit into more than one bucket. So these are not mutually exclusive. So food loss and waste, particularly the food waste part, is a part of reducing unsustainable consumption, while the food loss part is very much a part around reducing damage to natural environment, because a lot of the lost food or reducing greenhouse gas emissions for that matter. Okay, in the meanwhile, what has happened is I think food systems were kind of never a part of the mainstream COP agenda. Energy has always dominated and fossil fuel, and rightly so. But food systems kind of became more important since COP26. And then what we have done here is we have mapped all the initiatives that were launched at the COP since COP26. And we see that a lot of initiatives around agri-food were launched in COP28 that kind of fits into those 4 criteria that I talked about, 4 or 5 criteria. Now coming to the 2 things that we did in this year's report. By the way, all of you should have a small QR card on your chair, and if you scan it, you would get the whole report, plus there are fact sheets, etc. Yes, exactly, yeah. So the report is there, so I don't want to go into too much because we have an excellent panel of panelists, so we would really want to hear from them, so I'll keep my presentation short. So we have done 2 deep dives in this year's report, and these deep dives are around, one is around how to reduce emissions from livestock, and another is how to reduce emissions from fertilizers and fertilizer production and application. Within the livestock, we are necessarily looking at how do we reduce emissions from enteric methane emissions. That is basically the belching of livestock. And the route is through feeding them things that reduces the methane emissions from belching, literally. And there are 2 kinds. I mean, livestock systems, and we would have the Director General of ILRI who will join us online shortly, and he will talk much more about it. But overall, if you feed them certain kind of feed, and if those are stall-fed livestock like you have in the high-income countries, then we are talking about you feed them in a stall, so you can give them feed additives. So that's a technology a bit more focused on the high-income countries, very much along the line Timo said, that we have to differentiate our solutions. On the other hand, if we are talking of extensive pasture-fed cattle, which is the reality in much of Africa, then you cannot really feed your cattle in a stall and feed them additives. So it is more about innovations around forages, what kind of grass and legumes that they eat while they're foraging out on a pasture or on a on the ground. So those are the 2 kind of technologies we have looked at. And why we have looked at livestock is one of the largest source of emission within the agri-food system. So I don't want to read out the slides. The slides would also be available on our website. And anybody who wants it, I'm happy to share them with them. So then I already mentioned the two things we have done, reducing enteric emissions via methane inhibitors. So there are some products in the market, while they are quite cost effective, but still there are some barriers to adoption because, and these are mostly in the high income countries, so the cost may be a little bit higher than the conventional products, conventional feeds. So we have a few recommendations around it. And this is a particular one called 3-NOP or Bover. Then this is the other part I talked about, enteric methane emissions via low methane forages. Here the idea is that there are how do I say, forages, legumes and grasses which have anti-methanogenic compounds. So these are naturally like grass, legumes, etc., that leads to less emissions from the livestock, and they already exist, and some of them have to be also they have to be improved through cross fertilization with other varieties. So this is something that the CGIAR and I suppose many other organizations have been researching. We have some funding from BMGF and Bezos Fund, and I know Dr. Apollinaire will talk about it presently in the panel. Our second set of interventions we looked at in this report is around fertilizers. With the fertilizers, what happens is 30 to 40% of the emissions happens when you're producing the fertilizer at a factory. So that's when the emissions happens, and the remaining 60 to 70% emissions happens when farmers apply it on their farm. So we again present two technologies. So one is around green ammonia. So this is one of the technologies we cover. Green ammonia, again, suitable for everywhere, but right now the cost effectiveness perhaps makes it more suitable for high income countries. The idea is to move from brown ammonia, which is doing the Haber-Bosch process with fossil fuel, to green ammonia, which you can use then renewable energy. In between is blue ammonia. I believe the world is a bit divided around blue ammonia, and perhaps one of our panelists can also talk. Blue ammonia is almost equivalent to seeing as a hybrid car, which is kind of seen as, putting us in a bit more lock-ins for longer. So the idea is if we can move directly from brown ammonia to green ammonia, that is a better climate solution. But in some cases, practicality means that many of these companies are also doing CCS, carbon storage, carbon capture and storage, which also has its own issues. So maybe we can ask some of our panelists to reflect a bit on that. Then our second technology here is around fertilizer application via site-specific nutrient management. At the end of the day, the fertilizer you need really depends on your soil and your crop type. While across the world we have a lot of standardized recommendations of what fertilizer to use irrespective of those parameters. And we at the CG do a lot of work around soil management, nutrient management, and SIG is one of our panelists. She will talk about that. So here we are saying that advisories for farmers to do the right fertilizer at the right place at the right time and in the right amount. Those are the 4 R's. So how do we promote these technologies? So those are the 4 technologies. Now I come to the last part of my of our paper. It's a relatively short paper of around 30 pages. We were meant to do very specific recommendations. That was the ask. So we have 5 buckets of recommendation. Let me go one by one. Our first bucket is around increased climate finance. That these climate finance should be directed towards unlocking these potential of sustainable agricultural technologies. Here, and I'm very happy that we have raised here with the Climate Bonds Initiative. So we recommend that ensure that these technologies can benefit from green finance, particularly in high-income countries, by being included in Climate Bonds Initiative agriculture criteria. So we will hear a bit more about how that works, which will make those investments a part of country taxonomies and then enable green finance. For particularly the low and middle income countries, we talk about encouraging multilateral banks and development banks to provide concessional loans and grants, and working closely with the G7 and G20 agendas, where we have an agenda around food systems that was recently agreed upon. And our third recommendation is around repurposing agricultural subsidies. We have our colleague from IFPRI within the CG does a lot of work in looking at practical ways of repurposing agricultural subsidies, because we know a lot of subsidies goes to things that leads to more fossil fuel use, like subsidies to fertilizers that leads to overuse. Our second bucket of recommendations is around knowledge sharing. Here around making knowledge sharing on policy and implementation that will lead to faster uptake. So here we make a recommendation. We actually fell a bit shy of making a recommendation around nitrous oxide pledge, because at that point we could not agree to a particular number, like the methane pledge has 30% reduction. So we came down to something that we had a agreement within our scientists, and we had very large, extensive consultations. So what we agreed upon is a nitrogen use efficiency pledge, and I'm sure SIG will talk more about it. The idea is that there are parts of the world that overuse nitrogen fertilizers, so the efficiency can be as low as 30 to 40%, versus you have parts of sub-Saharan Africa that barely use fertilizers, so they're actually mining the soil. So there you have very high efficiency of 90%. When it comes to nitrogen use efficiency, high is not necessarily good. So the optimal number is around 60 to 70%. So in this report, we say aiming at 70% nitrogen use efficiency by 2030, with the idea that opens up space for places that underuse fertilizer to actually use them for productivity gains, and other places to reduce. We also have a recommendation around Codex Alimentarius, particularly around the methane inhibitors, like whether consuming products that uses methane inhibitors is actually permissible. So we want that to be under the WHO Codex Alimentarius. Then we have around a recommendation around how do we take advantage of the existing methane pledge and incentivize demand creation. And our final one is around engage in intensive exchanges of knowledge through some of the existing parameters. Our third bucket is around metrics and indicators. So we have a few around the fertilizer. The one is around expanding GHG accounting. Then we have something around deployment targets, and the industry, so recommendations both for government and industry around complete reporting structure or certification. For specific to the livestock sector, we have setting up of globally aligned regulatory frameworks and MRV requirements. And overall for both the sectors, we actually recommend something on the lines of Codex Alimentarius. It is a concept that has been popularized by WWF, and I understand the WWF is sponsoring also the breakfast. Unrelated to this event, I didn't know they were sponsoring the breakfast, just in case. But there is breakfast after this session, you can have some. But this was a concept originally proposed by WWF, and we, the authors, thought it was a good one. Countries should come together and work out Codex Planetarius. I'll come to that in a minute. Then our fourth bucket is around expanding research and development. Here we are talking about how do we use the existing global knowledge exchange, the nutrient management network. A lot of our CGIAR centers are already a part of it. And then how do we use these networks to actually increase funding for research and development. And that brings me to the final recommendation. This is around WTO. We call the Revive the Moribund WTO Agreement on Environmental Goods and Services. So this particular agreement does have, has a clause around promoting trade in essential environmental products, but only includes solar panels and wind turbines. So we are saying in future negotiations, the list of green goods and services should also include low carbon fertilizers like green ammonia and livestock additives, among other emission reducing technologies. And here we say that something like Codex Planetarius, where the standards would be agreed upon, and once it is agreed upon, then those would be conferred presumption of compliance by the WTO, just making trade easier. So with that, I finish. This is the entire CGIAR author team. We had like almost 7-8 consultations, over 200 people, scientists were consulted, and you can you can download our digital report. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, Aditi. Super interesting. I'd like to touch upon a few things and maybe then go out to the audience before I invite up our panel, so then you'll have plenty of things to think about in terms of background. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about this, and I'd like to maybe hear some people's points of views, is what I like about it is you've got global recommendations. You've got some recommendations which are sort of divided up between Global South and more appropriate for Global South and Global North. You have a focus on 2 technology areas, so we're not looking at 20 technology areas. But then some of the solutions are mainstreamed, if you like, throughout climate finance, Codex Planetarius, lots of different areas. I'd love to get people's feedback and questions maybe for Aditi before we go into the panel. I'm looking for some volunteers for some questions. Laura. It's a livestock question, and you're a lady who knows a lot about livestock.
Yes. Thanks, Aditi, for the presentation. And I know my DG is speaking later, so maybe he'll cover some of this, but can you talk a little bit about the differentiation within the report around what innovations are appropriate in which contexts, and how are those distinguished within the report?
Thanks, Lara. Just hold on to that, and maybe I can have one more question, maybe group 2 together.
Okay, Suresh Babu from IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute. Aditi, nice presentation, livestock and fertilizer, key elements there. You touched upon food loss and waste. There is increasingly interest in getting food loss and waste from agricultural sector to the NDC updates. We are having actually a 5-country project on that. How do you speed up that process? Where do we stand on this? Why can't we, CG as a whole, work on that? And where is work being done? I'm just curious.
Okay, so one question about accelerating NDCs, particularly food loss and waste, and the second one a little bit more detail, if you like, into the livestock angles.
Yeah, I think we are in the chapter, we kind of talk about the high income and the low and middle income context, more around the production systems, so more around industrial production versus pasture-based production. So we very much clarify that the products of the methane inhibitors are perhaps also not scientifically ready. I know Reyes will talk a little bit about it, because the science is also not 100% clear that those are already usable, and they're certainly not usable in the context of, like of a Maasai in East Africa. So we are very careful in making that distinction. I think that was a big struggle we had last year, because in agriculture is such a context-specific one, we just cannot say what works here will also work there. And Suresh Babu, we did have food loss and waste last year, but this year basically we had to zoom in into 2 technologies because of the usual time and resource constraint. So I believe food and loss and waste is a very important topic, and there would be a deep dive certainly in the next years, is my understanding. Yeah, okay.
And maybe, Sarush, that question that you asked, it might come back as well to our panelists I'm just about to introduce, in terms of what are their ideas about accelerating the uptake of science and technology into NDCs. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our 5 panelists. Dr. Sieglinde Snap, if you could come to take a seat. Reyes Tirado, the agri-food lead for the Climate Bonds Initiative, and Dr. Snap, who's the Deputy Director General for Research at CIMIT. Richard Ali, the Director of Corporate Affairs and Strategies and Stakeholder Relations at Tetra Pak. Thank you, Richard. And last but not least, Rebecca Brooks, who's from the UN High-Level Champions Office. And online we're joined by the Director General of ILRI, Dr. Apollinaire de King. Good morning, Apollinaire.
Good morning. Good morning, James.
So I'm going to start the questions with you, Apollinaire. You're the DG of ILRI. So building on the question that we just heard before, could you sort of tell us what ILRI is doing in the space of mitigating methane emissions for livestock, And what are the most important innovations that you're excited about?
Thank you, James. Greetings, everybody, colleagues. And let me thank Aditi for an excellent presentation of this breakthrough report. And you highlighted two things, fertilizer and livestock. Let me start by stating a few things in the context of livestock development. So one, the story of livestock in the global south is very different from the situation in the global north. I think it's very important for us to keep that in mind. At the onset, Timo talked about $1,000 investment that a farmer can afford in the Netherlands compared to the level of affordability or lack of it in Burundi. So that's the context that I would like to set. Livestock also comes to us as very heterogeneous production systems, and we broadly see three production systems. The pastoral systems, often very neglected, the mixed crop livestock systems, and also the semi-intensive production systems. I think with that differentiation, we can begin to address the question that my colleague Laura mentioned. If you have an innovation, where is it targeted? How can you make it relevant to the productions, to any of the production systems? So I also wanted to mention that. Secondly, whether we look at the livestock and agriculture generally, we are still relying on up to 70% or more of our food to be produced by small-scale producers. I think we have to keep that in mind. The key thing here is how can we address the issues that have been very eloquently posed, keeping that in mind, and essentially ensuring that we transition those small-scale producers to sustainable production. Very important. And the final number that I want to mention is that in the livestock sector, we still have up to 1.7 billion people relying directly or indirectly from livestock. So that's really the context within which I would like to offer my remarks. We're really excited as an organization, and by the way, this year we'll be celebrating 50 years of operation. Our innovations are driven from genetic innovation. I think that's really where I can illustrate and take a bit of time to say a bit more. We're also innovating from animal health. How can we keep healthy animals in farms across the world? The third one is really around nutrition. Nutrition, we can be formulation and things like that. And finally, how are we working with policymakers, ensuring that we have the right environment for some of these innovations to be taken up? In the genetic innovation space as an organization, we're at a point where we can build on diversity that we continue to have in the global south. We're able to collect data and also support the selection or breeding for low-emitting animals. I think that's really important for us to do that. And we are beginning to do that for farms, whether you have 10 animals or 100 animals. That's the technology and the innovation that we begin to see from genetic improvement. On animal health, yesterday or the day before yesterday, I gave a presentation on demonstrating how controlling diseases, reducing the disease burden is actually a very efficient way. It's low-hanging fruit for us to address climate issues. Mortalities and ineffective or non-productive animals because of diseases are actually emitting much more. We can control animal diseases and support better health as a way of reducing climate. The third science-based kind of innovation that we're doing is really around ensuring that some of the forage accessions that are everywhere in the production systems where we operate can actually be feeding animals, but also we select for accessions that promote reducing methane. Really accession that are high in antimethanogenic compounds. So those are the three main innovations that our work is really helping us to do. But what is really exciting at the moment is that yesterday we launched the Livestock and Climate Solutions Hub that ILRI and other CGIAR centers and partners will be delivering. It's an opportunity for us to bundle solutions to ensure that we are building on genetic innovations, on health innovation and nutrition to offer solutions to smallholder farmers, regardless of their production systems. Let me just use the example of the pastoral system to highlight the importance and the urgency for us to provide interventions there. I'm on this call sitting here in Kenya. If you look at large ruminants, up to 70% of the population of large ruminants in the country is held in pastoral systems. What can we do, to ensure that we have resilient animals there? We have animals that will continue to thrive during drought. I think we can select for climate resilient or temperature heat stress animals, tolerant animals. And I think those are some of the things that we can begin to do to ensure that we are delivering solutions in different production systems. And 70% of the total ruminant population in Kenya is held in this production system. You can see the economic importance and why we could invest in some of these technologies. Let me close by saying that the most exciting thing happening within ILRI and across the CGIAR as a whole is really our ability to go from one track solution to multiple track solution, essentially looking at the system as a whole, making sure that an animal or genetic resources that we want to offer to animals are the ones that will be resilient to diseases, will be emitting less, will be very bad feed converters, but at the end of the day, will be helping smallholder farmers generate income. We call it productivity plus plus. It's not just pushing for more milk or more eggs, but it's really doing it sustainably and ensuring that the bottom line is there. Because if you go to a farmer and you talk about reducing methane emission and things like that, the farmer will not get it. What is it that they want to buy? They want to see a resilient animal, healthy animal, and at the end of the day, they want to make money. So back to your question here, we see adaptation and mitigation as interlinked. In a different setting, I will be able to talk about the trade-offs that we want to create within this side of climate challenge. Once again, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate. As an institution, we're really excited and happy to see the recommendations that the Breakthrough Report has generated. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Apollinaire. Super interesting the way you brought together that for farmers it's really about adaptation and mitigation together. The one part of the solution doesn't work, and the ILRI as part of a CGIAR system is really fitting in, providing one aspect of a food systems approach. Speaking of one aspect, Dr. Snap, that leads me to, you're the top soil expert and you lead that work at CIMMYT. Can you talk about the ways that we can reduce emissions from fertilizer use without affecting farmer productivity? And then maybe to talk a little bit about what the barriers are facing farmers in adopting these new technologies.
Thank you so much. As you said, I'm Sig Snap from CIMMYT. And this is obviously an opportunity to talk about not just CIMMYT, but our partners and across the CG. But as Professor Apollinaire said, it is about bundling, about understanding together. But on the other hand, it's about nitrogen, right? We talk about zinc and sulfur and all these things, but the big greenhouse gas emitter is nitrogen. And nitrogen, I used to say as a professor at Michigan State, it's what's for dinner, because the biggest protein on this planet in almost every plant is rubisco. It takes tons of nitrogen to be able to fix carbon into the foods that we're eating here today. So we need lots of nitrogen. And, as you said, generating that can be a big problem. But it's kind of like the carbon. It's a win-win in that you don't sequester carbon without enough nitrogen. So, and in fact, as we heard, 90% efficiencies occur in Africa. And that's seen as, oh no, that's mining. But actually, if we get the biology right, if we could repurpose subsidies and put them where that high efficiency is, and where the yields are low, and we triple yields with that nitrogen at a 90% efficiency, I mean, what a win-win that is, right? But I think one thing that we have to be remembering is coupling carbon and water with nitrogen. So it comes back to bundling. So that means we need regenerative agriculture practices to make sure there's enough water there, because otherwise nitrogen is wasted. It's about information, because you have to know where your water is, where your soil organic matter, your health is there, so that you can put your fertilizer there. and the decision advisories we've been hearing about. Where you're using excess, obviously you need more information so you don't use an excess unless you have enough water, unless you have the right soil health. But I just want to really emphasize that we need to double down on the biology. For example, there is a historically really solid system in nature called biologically nitrification inhibition, BNI. So this isn't snake oil. This is actually something that works in nature all the time. It's a way that pasture grasses make sure they don't lose all that valuable nitrogen. But it's been moved recently into wheat, can be moved into other crops like potatoes and maize that all need a lot of nitrogen. You don't get root tubers, you don't get grain without nitrogen, right? So this means you can reduce nitrous oxides. So that's a massive win. And it's, in the end, it'll be embedded in the seed. It is embedded in the seed. Now we have to see which soil types it works best. It's still new days in terms of, as I said, it's been 30 years working in, that we've known about, that we've discovered it years ago. Mbrapa did actually, but anyways. So, but having it in the seed, that after all, that's what farmers invest in, their animals and in their seeds, is such a win-win, right? Because we talk so much about soil health. Well, inoculum doesn't work on its own. Microbes have to be in their home, which is roots. So we need to be thinking about plants and their associated microbes, and most of all, the people that actually plant those, making sure they have the informatics. So it really, I think this nitrogen efficiency, it is efficient in Africa. We just have to get productivity up, which has to do with getting the biology right, getting the information around where the water is, combined with improving soil health through regenerative ag. So it is, of course, once again, a bundled solution, but I think we really are seeing that there's some win-wins there around not just carbon for adaptation and mitigation, but nitrogen can be part of the solution, and it has to be part of the solution. And to do that, in the end, it comes down to people and making sure they have the right biology, as well as the right information for decision tools. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Snap. Actually, you touched upon an issue when you said repurposing. I'm sure that Reyes Tirado thought, well, that's finance, right? That's a segue to my question. So, you mean you've just launched the Climate Bond Initiatives for Agriculture Production, Crops and Livestock criteria. What are the types of technologies and approaches that have been used in that criteria, and how can they be used to decarbonize agriculture?
Great, thank you. And thank you. It's an honor to be on this very interesting panel. And I'm, as a doctor in biology, I really love the biology of the soil and how we can incorporate this. So in climate bonds, we work to unlock the finance that can really scale up those solutions that we have been talking about. So we develop criteria and standards with experts from across different institutions, including the CGIAR. So we're very lucky to have Aditi in one of our working groups. We have also Cinino Costa, who is an author also on the Breakthrough Report as part of the agriculture, crop and livestock production criteria. We do this with leading experts to come up with very concrete, actionable solutions within the agricultural space, focusing on mitigation, but also looking at adaptation and other safeguards that will really support farmers in making this transition. And let me just point to three main elements of this agriculture criteria that we have just developed. One is that agriculture is complex, it's super complex, but it's very super crucial. So we've developed a set of criteria, it's like a menu that is full of complexity, but also full of opportunity. So we really emphasize that there's a big challenge, there's many problems, but there's also many opportunities also with strong business cases. The second point is that 43 commodities make 90% of the food we eat. And we have developed transition pathways, science-based transition pathways for these 43 commodities so that entities and other institutions can really focus on these transitions to build debt instruments. In this case, for example, sustainability-linked debt, where they can access this capital, both for CapEx, for capital, and also for OpEx, for operational, to embark in this transition that will get them as close as possible to net zero, if not possible, or on a transition that is 1.5 aligned. As part of this, there's also context, right? Because these transition pathways are global in nature, but they include a lot of context specific. And this is where the other set of financial instruments called the green bonds, something like the use of proceeds, they're basically financial instruments that can be only targeted to a specific initiatives within the portfolio of farming or the portfolio of an entity, can be public, private, etc. Within those, we have identified 4 pillars of those interventions. Within each of these pillars, there are many interventions, and I'll touch on some of them before, but the 4 pillars, after the 4 pillars are reducing emissions, and these include, for example, livestock and fertilizers, very big important points, but also we include carbon sequestration, because farmers at the same time of reducing emissions need to sequester carbon, so there's a lot of opportunities also there. And then we also include adaptation, because as we have heard, these things need to be bundled, and there's a lot of adaptation needs within the farming communities also. And then we have a 4th category, which also is very much related to research and development, that are those activities that enable those interventions. And those are what we call supporting activities. They can happen outside the farm, for example, by research institution. And this is where we put those initiatives that are maybe less developed or less proven at the moment, but will benefit a lot from this research to really unlock that potential. I want to end by saying that land is super crucial, as we know here, the whole Article 6 discussions we've been hearing this week and last week. Land in agriculture need to become extremely carbon negative. This is a challenge, but it's also a very big opportunity. There's recent analysis that shows that, for example, when we include agriculture carbon sinks, the GHG price can be reduced by 48%. Because you include a huge potential there that otherwise remains untapped. So it's really the criteria we develop, and then the engagement we do with different financial institutions, with different entities, is about challenges, but it's very much about the opportunities that can be unlocked.
Thanks a lot, Reyes. Could I ask you maybe just to look at the 4 technologies in the report and to see if there's any of them that are standing out at you, say, yes, there's a real fit here in terms of our criteria and these technologies?
Yes, thank you very much. So, yes, getting into the specifics, under this pillar that I mentioned on reducing emissions, we include specific things that can be done. We call them eligible measures, so that measures that then can be part of this portfolio of financial instruments like green bond or use of proceeds. Under reducing methane, and under reducing methane we have rice, but also we have interventions on livestock. Now, on livestock we have focused mostly on reducing animal herds by increasing efficiency, by increasing productivity per area of land or animal. And we have not included specifically the feed additives, for example, as directly eligible measures right now as additive measure, because there's the group that we work with many top experts, thought that this was already not developed enough and could lock in initiatives that might be risky. Remember, this is about capital investment, so there's a very big risk aversion in these elements. So then we did not include this specific one or the forage one, mostly because of something that was just mentioned. 70% in many areas, up to 70% of the livestock is produced in pasture. And many of these innovations cannot really be applied to pastures yet. So that's one thing that is not included on the eligible measures per se. However, and this is very important, is included under these enabling activities that I mentioned. So research and development on these specific initiatives is very much part of the portfolio, so can be part of the portfolio. Same, very similar with nitrogen, but within that we have green ammonia, for example, as one of the eligible measures under reducing emissions. So there's already green bonds that can include that, and also site-specific nutrient management is very much part of the initiatives around reducing nitrous oxide, with nitrogen use efficiency being one of the key parts under the green bonds that can be deployed in this space. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I love the way this is going. We started off with the technologies and the emissions, we moved to the finance, and then when the finance comes in, it needs to go to a middle, they say, the missing middle. Richard, you had a conversation with Aditi where you spoke a little about the missing middle and what Tetra Tech was doing in terms of working in this missing middle. What are you doing there, and how does it relate to emissions reductions?
Thanks very much. I guess most people here have heard of Tetra Pak, probably through our packaging, which obviously is there. It takes the product from processors and it makes it available affordably and accessibly to consumers. And the great thing about Tetra Pak is actually it's aseptic packaging. So what I mean is it doesn't require refrigeration, which obviously has a huge impact on making sure product can be distributed without that cold chain. But more than that, Tetra Pak is also a major supplier of food processing equipment. So we are very much in what we call the hidden middle. A lot of attention, quite rightly, is paid at farm level. But most farmers, interestingly, don't go beyond that farm gate. And a lot of product, and I look round here, is actually edible raw material. It has to be processed to some degree before it reaches the consumer. So unless you have that processing capacity, actually you just result in huge amounts of food loss and waste. And we've heard about the impact of food loss and waste. And if we are going to achieve what we want to, so an acre, a hectare of land, we want to get more out with less. But I would say that more out needs to be calculated by the time it gets to the consumer. So that sustainable intensification, if you like, needs to include all factors of the chain. And I've been so impressed, this has taken me back years. I'm an agricultural economist by training. I did livestock economics, I did soil science. All these things are absolutely superb. But we work within a three-dimensional jigsaw. We have a lot of the solutions available today. The challenge is how we make them available. And of course, Baku COP29 is all about finance. So a couple of things. Let me give you an example of what Tetra Pak does. So we invest, we innovate in that center, in that hidden middle. A lot of our attention is on the dairy industry, is on liquid foods and beverages. So that might be alternative proteins, oat milk, etc., etc. But one example, our one-step technology, which is all about UHT milk. So that's giving milk not quite immortality, but at least a much longer shelf life. We reduce electricity by about 29%. It cuts emissions by over 30%. It cuts water use by over 41%. It reduces waste in processing. It means you can have a bigger tank. All those things are available today. The challenge, and I'm not talking about the massive, biggest dairy companies in the world. 80% of our customers are small and medium-sized enterprises. But often the challenge for them, and we talked earlier about, if you are a farmer, a smallholder, what might be simple in the Netherlands is not simple as a smallholder farmer, or indeed a relatively small processor. So we need to make sure that, firstly, there is more money applied to the agri-food chain as a whole. At the moment, it's about 4% of climate finance, whereas in actual fact, of course, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it's over 30%. I'm not a policymaker, but I'd love to find out why. And the other point is, if you're going to do finance, make sure it's a jigsaw. If you only aim your finance at one part of the chain, it might not actually deliver the final outcome that you want. And I think that's really important. And the other thing on finance, and I'm going to say it, is, can we have some really simple finance so small operators can access it? I heard a guy from Jamaica the other day on a panel, and he said, look, we're a small fruit producer. We have lots of finance available in Jamaica. But he said, I can't access it because the amount of paperwork and data I have to provide makes it absolutely uneconomic for me to stop doing what I do in terms of producing to fill in all these forms. And a lot of mechanisms, I did used to work in banking as well, are so complicated, unless you have a degree in finance, you're just not going to be able to start. So we need standardization and simplification of financial instruments that by the time they get to the small producers, people can go, that's what I can get and that's what I can spend it on. I know there has to be enforcement, I know there has to be auditing, but it cannot be beyond the wit of man to achieve that. So, how do we get that to work? Well, first of all, I would say we need some ring-fenced funds for that hidden middle, that processing sector. This isn't about money going to Tetra Pak. There are other providers as well, you know. So, but what we want to see is that the small and medium-sized enterprises have access to that finance, have access to either upgrade their existing equipment to make it more energy efficient, to reduce food waste within it, or if they're in emerging economies, to actually buy new equipment to give smallholder farmers access to processors. The processors get stability, stable supply, which means they can operate correctly. That reduces the price to consumers because you've got less waste in the chain. And the farmers gain, of course, from having that market. One of the things we do run is something called dairy hubs. So we work with our customers to work with smallholder farmers to improve their yields, which of course actually reduces the amount of carbon emissions that they're putting into the chain. They improve their yields, they get a bigger income, food security is increased within the country, and that stability goes. It's a win-win for absolutely all those partners. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So it's really coming together here. So now the last part, we have the financial products. It's not beyond the wit of man to be able to develop guidelines to be able to pick up on the technologies that both Apollinaire and Dr. Snap referred to. So the question is, Rebecca, you work at the Office of the Climate Champion. You're one of the key stakeholders of the Breakthrough Agenda from the beginning. What is needed to help civil society and government players really move forward with the adoption of the recommendations of the Breakthrough Agenda?
Thanks so much, James, and great to be here. Yes, so the high-level champions have been involved in the Breakthrough Agenda since its inception. And for those of you who might not know us, the role of the high-level champions was created as part of the Paris Agreement at COP21 in 2015. And it was really from the acknowledgement from governments that to reach the Paris Agreement's goal, governments must work hand in hand with actors in the real economy. So the mandate of the high-level champions is to activate and accelerate climate action really by amplifying the diverse contributions of non-state actors. So from cities, civil society, philanthropy, finance and businesses to farmers, indigenous peoples, women and youth. And so by articulating the opportunity and showcasing solutions for partnerships, for innovation and for capital flows, we can give governments the confidence to adopt more ambitious policies. So we're really delighted to be part of the Agriculture Breakthrough Agenda with the governments that Aditi mentioned that are leading this. And huge congratulations to Aditi and the team for the launch of the report. It's great to build on the previous work that you've been doing and really dive deeper into these two areas of livestock and fertilizers to get into those specific recommendations for international collaboration. I think it is really important to emphasize, as Aditi mentioned, that it must be part of a wider food systems holistic approach. So not just about agricultural production, but consumption, food loss and waste, protecting and restoring nature. And technology is a really important part of the solution set, but one part. And obviously that solution set will differ depending on local contexts. So when we think about translating the recommendations of the report, obviously non-state actors really have a key role to play here. It's the farmers, it's the businesses, the financial institutions that are delivering a lot of the action. And we heard yesterday in the COP to COP Agri-Food Legacies event that we really need more collaboration between states and non-state actors to co-design the solutions. So this really is about creating more inclusive multi-stakeholder dialogues, especially including those on the front line of agri-food systems to ensure a just transition that doesn't unduly burden the most vulnerable. And this is something that we're working on through the Food Systems Call to Action that we launched at COP28 under the leadership of Her Excellency Razan Al Mubarak, who's the high-level champion for COP28. And this has now been endorsed by over 300 food systems actors, and we launched a report yesterday with our partners, the Just Rural Transition and Ambition Loop. And it calls on governments to put in place the enabling conditions for others to accelerate action and to go further faster. So this is a lot of the recommendations that are in the report around creating more incentives, repurposing subsidies, setting taxonomies, and making climate risk reporting and disclosure mandatory, as many of the other actions in the report. And I'd love to see how we can work with CGIAR and the governments in the agriculture breakthrough agenda to bring more non-state actors into the agenda around these dialogues, inclusive dialogues between governments and these actors to move the agenda forward. So I really think it's about creating the spaces to do that, and I think we'd love to work with you on that as we go forward. And then I think you also said, you asked me to think about the focus for next year's report, and would love Aditi's thoughts on this as well. I think we could either go further into one of the areas that we've done in this report, so further into fertilizers and really sort of build a bit of a coalition between the governments and the non-state actors to dive into that. Or we could also move our focus towards more of a consumption aspect. I think that's we focus a lot on agricultural production, but the consumption aspect, the demand side, I think also warrants attention. And if governments can set really clear signals on that, like we're seeing cities do through public procurement and other aspects, I think that would be really helpful. Thanks, James.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. So what I'd like to do now is maybe to look out to the audience or to any of our speakers, including Apollinaire online. If you'd like to pick up on any of the points that were raised by any of the speakers, or something you'd like to come back on that struck a chord. Apollinaire, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, for you extended an invitation to the CGIAR to work, and I think we gratefully take that invitation. I think we would like to work together. And that the part of the convening multi-stakeholders is really one of the things that we would like to use to drive the livestock and climate solution hub that we've talked about. Let me just use livestock as an entry. We can talk about it as a climate solution hub. I think we would like to really, one of the pillars that we've said is really about convening multi-stakeholder around a platform, to evaluate technology relevance and the ability to scale it up. The second thing is really about making sure that we scale through clear partnerships, relevant partnership, because if you're good at doing proof of concept, you may not be the best to scale to extend to millions of farmers. I think that's one of the things that we hope we can engage you through the call that you've just made. And we also want to use the opportunity of bringing multi-stakeholders around to provide evidence for policy and advisory. I think this is where we are really short some of the times to really put evidence on the table to support decision making. And from the part of the world where we are located, we are beginning to see clear demand from the government. How can you support me to take the left or go to right or stand still? And I think that's really the call that we would like to answer. And Rebecca, thank you so much. We want to take on that. And the CGIAR, we are looking at 2030 with a new portfolio of research and programs and accelerators that we may not have the time to talk about that now, but we are really confident and excited that we've created a very good framework to work amongst ourselves at CGIAR centers, but really go beyond the CGIAR to ensure that we deliver solutions and we really deliver interventions on time. And one of the things that I want to talk about is really scaling for impact. It's a program that we've established to ensure that we have strong connectivity from innovation to scaling. It's really not just blindly putting technologies out there, being very intentional, understanding the context, as we've mentioned earlier, and knowing that a farmer with only 2 animals can only afford certain things that a farmer with 1,000 animals will. So that's really the operation provisions that we've put in place. And thank you so much for that call. I felt that I really had to answer this. And we, in different settings, we would like to share with you extensively what's really in what we call Portfolio 2025-2030, because we really want to aggressively ensure that we deliver things meeting our requirements for 2030 Sustainable Development Goal. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Apollinaire. I have a question coming down from this part of the audience, and then Reyes wants to come in as well.
Thank you so much. Congratulations to CGIAR for organizing such a brilliant event. So I have a compliment to the gentleman from the Tetra Pak. I don't know your name, but the most important point you just raised, to make things simplify. So that is something very important that I've been working in a FCDO funded project, and I had a very close engagement with the community members. So when it comes to the climate, a collective effort is required. Without a collective effort, you cannot achieve this global goal. So that's a very clear thing. So for the collective effort, simplify and a universal adaptation of a mechanism is very important. So that's thank you so much for raising this point, and I think everyone should consider this component to make things simple for the ordinary person. That's a one component. And the second component, it's a question as well, that recently there has been a development in the EU that they have added a category of no risk in their EDUR regulations. So the no risk category in their EDUR regulations will allow some countries to destruct their forest, existing protected lands. So I think there has been some gap between while developing these kind of the policies to engage each and every stakeholders from the society to during the policy development. So that's why I think some countries, some policymakers considered it no risk. So there's an issue with their own understanding. So I think it would be great to engage every stakeholder with a simplified method to let them understand the depth of this issue. And as per my experience, that when you are engaging with the local communities and the stakeholders, communicate in their language, communicate in their own understanding behavior. Just an example, last thing, then I'll be compiling this question and comment, that I was engaging with one of the community members. They are known for their backwardness and their illiteracy. So you'll have to start from their shoe. You'll have to put your feet in their shoe, that ask them what kind of the changes you have been experienced for the last 10 years. So I think most of the people will share that they have experiencing a change in the climate. That ask, what was the last time you saw a beautiful butterfly in your garden? So it will start raising some red flags in their brain. So then you can have a discussion from that particular starting area. So make things simplify without any complication, because this is a collective agenda. So that's the question is, for this EDUR component just happened in the EU. So what policies and what strategies I think CGIAR will have to consider in the future to compile the policy. And I have been following the work of CGIAR and IMI as well. So brilliant work, congratulations. And I think collective effort is required. Thank you.
Let me go back to the two there. Back to you, sir. Richard, let you think about the types of strategies you have in outreach to multi-stakeholders, and I'll go to Reyes. And then if somebody from CGIAR wants to go back on the specific CGIAR point, if not, I guess we'll have to come back to you. Reyes.
Yes, thank you. This has been a super exciting, engaging conversation. I just want to point on, to add into 3 points. One is on the simplicity. And of course, this is always the difficulty and the demand we have for the criteria, to try to make it as simple as possible for the financial institutions that are going to be applying this, and also for the farm portfolios and so on. On the other hand, investors want certainty. They want metrics. They want to be able to de-risk those investments, but being able to measure. And there's a difficult balance to strike there. However, there's also, again, a very big opportunity. And under those eligible measures that I mentioned on supporting activities or enable, there's a big opportunity for business to develop this capacity building, technical assistance, so that this disclosing on emissions and getting the metrics right is something that can be supported with a lot of growth also. The second point I want to make is about the breakthrough report, which I think is for us, it has been a great tool to then be able to advance some of these maybe future potential innovative solutions that maybe at the moment are not super solid to include in the criteria, but they're coming up. And these criteria are updated every few years. So it's like looking into the future in what are going to be the big elements. And I just had an example. We in Climate Bonds also advise governments when they are developing the taxonomies. The taxonomies are these regulations that point into what are the green financing that countries would allow, basically, and would label. We've been advising Australia, and in Australia, feed additives have been developing a lot, and there's a lot of research by the research institutions there in terms of feed additives for livestock, and they have included this in the taxonomy. So this is already something that is there, in part thanks to this type of report that point into the solutions to the future. The third point, very quickly, is on just transition. And I think this is, for us also, and we try very much to think about food systems in the program I lead, and we have food value chain criteria. We are developing the alternative protein criteria to have this very big menu, because this is very complex, right? We want simplicity, but we also want to address this complexity. And just I will say that a remaining homework for us is to really see how this can include just transition, and can we really think about small and medium enterprises, how can they apply this? Because these frameworks are usually for green bonds that are 500 million, something like this. So how can we really then, and I'm super open and would be delighted to collaborate in this, into thinking how can we really make this applicable to a just transition framing. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Reyes. So maybe there's also some ideas for the next edition of the Breakthrough, or some of the across. Ali, if I could bring you back, Richard, to some of that experience that you have with dealing, I guess, in a sense, between the food world and the finance world, and trying to explain to both, because yes, there are farmers that have literacy problems, but there are also bankers who have agriculture knowledge deficiencies.
Yes, possibly. Thank you for that. First of all, on the generality of legislation like EUDR, etc., I actually think one of the important things, and I'm looking at a poster on the wall which just says food security. To me, there is a real importance that as part of all legislative proposals, doesn't matter what it is, there needs to be a food security test. Very simply, does this piece of legislation, proposal, affect food security? Yes or no? If it's yes, what is it? You avoid the unintended consequences by doing that. It's a big challenge, but actually it is the one thing I think that can help just transition. It can help science, make sure things are science-led and evidence-led, and make sure you're going for the right outputs and right outcome, because that is really important, not only to people, but business, and also to policymakers. You don't want to have to go back and change policy after you've agreed something 3 years later. Egg on face time, basically. So, what do we want to see in terms of strategy? I'm going to say this. I think for the breakthrough agenda, the next one should be on food loss and waste across the entire chain, because I think 10% of greenhouse gas impact is food loss and waste. It is so big that there needs to be greater attention across all stakeholders, across all platforms, because I think there's a lot of each part we can do together as a chain. I think industry would love to be involved in helping to develop financial mechanisms that actually help small and medium-sized enterprises, smallholder farmers, do what they need to do. So we'd love to take up your offer. I think that is very, very positive. In terms of that sort of general strategy, I go back to the jigsaw. We want to make sure that the jigsaw pieces fit and we start to get that picture, because once we start to get the picture, it actually becomes easier. The difficulty with the jigsaw is, where do I start? I've got all the pieces there, and we do have all the pieces there. But until you actually make a start and start to see what the picture looks like, it's actually quite difficult. But if we start to get that mentality of saying, these are the pieces that we start to join, then it becomes easier and easier, and you gain that momentum. For anyone that's done a jigsaw, I think you'll agree, the most difficult bit is looking in the box going, where do I start? But as you go along, easier and easier, greater momentum, and it's the same on the solutions that we already have. Bring them together.
Thanks a lot, Richard. I have one more question from the gentleman in the audience, and you want to start moving to the wrap-up? So let me go to the gentleman, go to you, and then everybody has one response based on all, and then we can go to the sum-up.
Thank you. I'm Harrison Noko from Cameroon. I work with an NGO called AGESH, and we're working with supporting communities in all these climate issues. Wonderful presentations to all of you, and I appreciate it. My question cuts across Dr. Apollinaire and Terra Park and Just Transition. My worry is with all this financial, talking about making it simplified, and he talked about policy. My worry now is how do we blend this, especially I want Apollinaire to talk about this again, looking at the nomads that we have, where they are moving. We're talking about developing financial mechanisms that are simplified. How do we get these people, when I come back to your calendar behind you, leaving no one behind, getting these nomads who are always moving. We also have community people who do not have access. No matter how you simplify it, we'll still have academic into it. We'll still have access of getting documentations for these people to access funding or to access the resources that we are putting in place. How do we contextualize this to fit the rural people who may not be capable to reach food security, and at the same time have, how when we talk about cattle headers, those who have never gone to school are the ones who are keeping the majority of the animals, and how these things are moving and how it's affecting climate, how climate change is also being, or most of the environment is being distorted with all of this. So how do we get to this just transition, making sure that the community, these nomads, and those local people can access all of this, and we blend this with science and technology that we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And very quickly here.
Yeah, and I'll say very quickly. And my name is Ibrahim, and I'm representing civil society and network organization advocating from the marginalized groups. And my question and follows to the colleague in terms of ineligibility of education barriers that the slow farmers have. In our context example, we belong the largest area of agricultural, but our community is 20% and those who have been studied. And what is the implication of inclusive manner in terms of us passing for the requirement and also inclusion perspective, as we have been having the term of no one left behind? Thank you very much.
Two questions about being simple but also being inclusive. I'm just going to hand over to Aditi with another comment, and then maybe to everybody for a final comment.
My comment was looking to the next year's report. I think it's not enough to say that these technologies and approaches are available, but we have to do something particularly around the concept of just transition, and maybe look at the instruments for that, like social protection, more on the policies and institutions. So technology focus, I think, is fantastic, but these are precisely the kind of questions that we keep getting back. How? I mean, what are those instruments? So many of these technologies, while farmers who already have various challenges, while they adopt those, there would be a lag between the time they can adopt those and the productivity losses they might have, or some kind of, livelihood disruption they might have. So during this transition, what are those instruments available to protect their livelihoods, protect their instruments? So it won't be so technology focused. So the breakthrough really have a very, very technology focus. So I'm not sure if it's possible to overcome the technology focus, but actually include some of those actual nuts and bolts of just transition, because we need to figure those out. How do we do those things? So that was one of the things I was thinking, listening to all the panelists' comments, and particularly the comments from the audience.
Thank you, Aditi. Going beyond technologies are not enough. Inclusion. How do we have this simplicity, but at the same time this specificity, because things are different? So I'm going to call Apollinaire to respond, and then maybe to everybody just a quick last point. Apollinaire, the questioner, sort of asked specifically about populations who are of pastoralists.
So thank you, James and Harrison. Thanks for mentioning this. I think we have close to 2 decades working in those areas. We have something called participatory rangeland management, essentially engaging communities in those areas to look at some of the issues and have them to participate. I think we can do a bit more. And that would be a framework for us to introduce any intervention that will be co-designed by communities. And secondly, ILRI has a celebrated index-based livestock insurance, which is a mechanism that we've put in place with partners, of course, to ensure that we can de-risk some of the assets in those areas. There is much more that we can do in those areas. Really speaking to inclusivity, I think we are set to close that gap and make sure that we are not just working for communities, but we're having them engaged, they have their voice. This is sitting in the social cultural context and things like that. But the urgency to do that is also to deflect some of the conflicts that we're beginning to see in those areas. It's absolutely important that we come in with some of that understanding. So, and one of the programs that we have here is really data-driven, ensuring that we get some of the data to predict some of the risks that in the short, medium, and long-term communities in those very vulnerable areas will be facing, and how we can advise them and what solutions they can bring to begin to solve that. Let me just flag one last point, which was mentioned. We haven't really talked about food losses and waste. And this is where we have a real opportunity to reduce the burden and really make some changes in the system, and use that also for the circularity in the system that we do have. So it's something that we don't talk often, but I want us to pick up some of this and ensure that it's not just about productivity, it's really maintaining and making sure that what we produce is processed to up to safety. And finally, it's about, we see this as a triple win: productivity, climate adaptation, and climate change. And there are also multiple wins that we really want to bring into the equation here. As we look at multiple wins, we will not leave anybody behind. I really like the background there. Let's not leave anybody behind. Not even my grandparents and my parents in the rural western part of Cameroon. I think we have the solution, and we know how we can engage. Thank you so much for the great session.
Thank you, Apollinaire. Now I'm going to ask, I'm being cut by time, so what I want to ask you in a quick 30 seconds about maybe a reflection of sort of moving forward.
Yes, so very quickly I would say too, based on what we have heard, in order to, there's many elements, right? So you start to think about agriculture and finance for green bonds, for example, and this opens the questions about the smallholders, just transition, how do we make it simple? It's never ending, right? There's so many things to cover. So 2 things on that. First is that I feel within the COP space, we have been seeing in the last 3 COPs more attention to agriculture, but I think this needs to be scaled up a lot more and be part really of the political discussions on how we bring all of this, how we increase the finance directed to the farmers, how we make food security part of this also in terms of climate impacts and adaptation. So very big call for this to be central. And the second one is on collaboration. So all these things that we have opened up in this very short conversation, they can be followed up with programs that addresses this. But for that, we need collaboration, support, finance, and so on. So yeah, I would do that. Thank you.
Thank you. So people will be shocked because I'm going to talk about technology, and my career has been about farmer participation and participatory assessments, as we've heard. And I think that participatory you know, the Green Revolution, there is something there. We did feed a lot of people. Norman Borlaug is attributed to saving millions of lives. And so, but we didn't reach the last mile. We know that in Africa. So if we re-look at these seeds, because seeds do get to people, and then the seeds for the forage as well, if we make sure that they are inherently just, in that, then we can, that's something simple. Seeds encapsulate if they fix their own nitrogen, because current seeds require tons of nitrogen, so it inherently are unjust, right, for the planet anyways. So if we have seeds that have within themselves the just characteristics and meet farmers, particularly women and youth, needs that have been overlooked, then I think it actually is a lot about enabling environments and green finance and green ammonia, but it's also about the seeds. Thank you.
Okay, 30 seconds. So, number one, we need to unlock the hidden middle because of its links to farmers. Secondly, we need to enable the access to SMEs and smallholders to that finance in as simple a way as we can. Thirdly, we need policy which supports, and I look at the gentleman who mentioned smallholder farmers and nomads. We need to make sure the business models on the ground are empathetic to the communities that they are there to serve. And finally, and this is perhaps really, really important, we take a comprehensive and holistic view of the food system, because ultimately the food system is there to feed people, and that helps us achieve just transition across the chain.
Thank you. Yes, so I think I just want to really say I really appreciate and agree with the comments from the audience, and I think it's really about, you know, we need to get to the destination. It's really about the process, and that means more dialogues, bringing more actors in, and really those on the front lines who are often not in the conversation. We need to do that really more of that to get to a just transition. I think we're getting better at that. You know, it's increasing through the COPs and other global processes, but we need to get better. And I completely agree that we need to take a food systems approach. So yes, it's absolutely about food security, but in order to get to food security, it's about addressing that whole systems approach across food loss and waste, agricultural production, and consumption shifts.
So, last but absolutely not least, I'm going to go back to Aditi to give some closing remarks, and I'd like to thank everybody in the audience and the really exciting panel. Aditi, over to you to close.
Thanks so much, James. This was such an enriching discussion. I was supposed to be taking copious notes to have my concluding remarks ready, but I was so enthralled that I actually did not take any notes. It's all in my mind. I was paying 100% attention. So I think very briefly we heard that we need to begin with science. I really liked your idea of a just seed. I think that seeded a very nice idea that the seeds have to be just. But to me, I see that as more of an example of we have to do our science right. We have to do our science right in such a way that the science embodies equity in it itself. It could be seeds, but it could be also a just fertilizer. Like, you know, the product needs to be right, that meets the needs of the smallholder farmers. And then that brings us to the part around finance. There is a lot of finance out there. How do we actually access that finance? How is it suitable for smallholder producers? And that brings us into the arena of policy, governance, institutions, and partnerships. And in middle is, of course, the very important part around agro-processing, around connecting people to the market and market to the people, and vice versa. So I think what we today essentially heard, even though we started with fertilizer and livestock, we ended up hearing the whole system approach around food systems and the importance of doing it in a just and a fair way. So I thought it was fantastic, and we hope that the 2025 Breakthrough Agriculture Agenda Report, which I hope again will be a standalone report like this year, can focus on some of these things that we discussed today: food loss and waste, more focus on institution policies and pathways for just transitions. With that, I want to really thank all the panelists. I think it was a very, very good panel. I learned and enjoyed a lot. And also to all our audience for joining us here at the CGIAR FAO Pavilion. The video would be available online. It has been live streamed, so if you want to watch it again or forward it to your colleagues, please feel free to do that. I see you have a comment, so we have to really wrap up, but please go ahead.
Just a small remark, because I have to add that we have to take attention to the woman's right to the land. This is very important to get access to the food, to the land, because the land is essential for the woman and for food security of the woman and the family. Thank you, because I'm working with women, I'm working with the farmers, I know what is on the ground. And we have to bring this global, what we are speaking here, to the local. This is very important to bring the bridges between this, what we are doing here, and what we will do on the ground with the people. Thank you so much.
I think with that really, really good note, we should not forget that women still don't own land, yet they bear the brunt of the agriculture labor. We would like to conclude. Thank you very much for that comment. So thank you, everyone.
And a round of applause from everybody. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.